The drive back from the notary's office should have taken 20 minutes. I drove for an hour instead, taking the long way around the peninsula, watching the November rain streak across the Strait of Juan de Fuca, not quite ready to go home and face the reality of what I now carried. My brother Robert had left me everything. His house in Oak Bay, the Blue Craftsman on Windsor Road, he'd spent 30 years restoring by hand, with the old-growth fir floors, and the view of the Gary Oaks from the upstairs study had appraised at $2.2 million. His investment accounts, built carefully over 4 decades as a project engineer with BC Hydro, came to another $1.4 million. The vintage furniture, the coin collection he'd obsessed over since childhood, the small paintings from local artists he'd acquired one by one at the Oak Bay Arts Festival every August, another $80,000 at minimum. Just under 3.7 million Canadian dollars, and all of it now mine. Robert had never married. He used to say the right woman would have to love both him and his coin collection equally, and he'd never found her. No children, no ex-partners with legal standing, no complicated arrangements. Just Robert, his house, his garden, and a will that had been with the same notary for 15 years, entirely unambiguous. He'd written me a note, tucked inside the envelope with the official documents. "You were always the sensible one. Do something wonderful with it." I was 68 years old, 33 years at the Canada Revenue Agency as a forensic accountant, tracking financial fraud and hidden assets through paper trails most people believed were invisible. I'd retired 4 years earlier on a good pension, moved in with my son Daniel and his wife after my hip surgery, and told myself it was temporary. That had been 18 months ago. Now I was wealthy in a way I'd never imagined, and all I wanted was to share the news with my family. I turned onto their street in Saanich just after 6 in the evening. The lights were on in the kitchen. I could see the yellow glow through the front hedge as I pulled into the driveway, and for a moment I sat in the car and just felt it, the strange, guilty lightness of good fortune arriving through grief. Robert had been gone 3 months. The loss of him was still a constant low weight in my chest, but tonight I let myself feel something alongside it. I grabbed my bag and walked up the side path toward the back entrance, the way I always did, the way I'd done 1,000 times in the past year and a half. The kitchen window was open despite the rain, just a crack, the way my daughter-in-law always kept it when she was cooking. I could hear her moving around inside, the sound of a pan on the stove. I was 5 steps from the door when I heard my name. "So your mom actually gets the whole thing?" My daughter-in-law's voice. Low, focused. Not the voice she used at the dinner table or in front of my granddaughter. The voice she used when she was calculating something. The notary confirmed it this afternoon. I called his office. "My son. 3.7 million. The house alone is over 2 million. That's insane." Robert didn't even stay in touch with her half the time. A brief pause. "That doesn't matter now. What matters is it's hers, and it doesn't have to stay that way." I stopped walking. My hand was 6 inches from the door handle. The rain fell quietly around me, and I did not move. "What do you mean?" my daughter-in-law asked. "There's something called a representation agreement. Under the Adult Guardianship Act, if someone's found to be mentally incapable of managing their own affairs, a family member can apply to act as their decision-maker. Financial and personal decisions, all of it. I've been looking into this for a while. She's not incapable. She does that crossword every morning without looking anything up. She doesn't have to actually be incapable." My son's voice was patient, carefully instructive. "She just has to appear that way long enough to get through an assessment. I've already spoken with someone. A geriatric psychiatrist who does these evaluations. He's helped a colleague of mine with something similar. You manage it over 4 to 6 weeks, the right medications, the right environment, confusion, disorientation. You create enough of a pattern that when the assessment happens, it supports what we've already told him." I pressed my back flat against the exterior wall. The cedar boards were cold and damp through my coat. "And after?" my daughter-in-law asked. "Then I'm her legal representative. I manage her finances, her housing, everything. We sell the Oak Bay house, 2.2 million. We pay off the credit line, the casino account, your mother's loan, and then we live the way we've been trying to live for the past 4 years. The investments. How long before we can touch those? A few months, to be careful. But yes, All of it comes through us. I do not know precisely how long I stood there. Long enough for the rain to soak through my coat and into the collar of my blouse. Long enough to hear them laugh at something I couldn't quite catch, and the sound of a timer going off, and my daughter-in-law saying something about the oven. Then I turned and walked back to my car, got in, closed the door without a sound, and sat with my hands resting in my lap. My son had been planning this before Robert died. I knew this with the same settled certainty I'd felt hundreds of times over 33 years. Sitting across a desk from a person whose documentation told me exactly who they were beneath the performance of their ordinary life. Some people, when you stripped away the surface, turned out to be entirely different underneath. I had learned to recognize that reality, without flinching, without surprise, as a professional matter. I had not expected to need that recognition here. For perhaps 10 minutes, I sat in the driveway and felt it, the particular hollowness of understanding that a version of the world you believed in has ceased to exist. Not dramatic, just gone, quietly, the way a fact simply becomes true. Then I did what I had been trained, over decades, to do when faced with something designed to disorient me. I started to think. They believed I didn't know. That was the only advantage I had, and it was a significant one. They were planning to begin soon. The conversation had the brisk, procedural quality of a project already underway, which meant I had very little time, and I needed to spend it precisely. I took out my phone and called my oldest friend, Helen. We had worked together at the CRA for 20 years before she retired to Nanaimo. She picked up on the second ring. Margaret. Bit late for a social call. I need you to listen carefully and not ask anything until I'm finished. She went quiet. All right. I told her everything. The inheritance, the conversation, the exact phrases my son had used, representation agreement, mentally incapable, adult guardianship act, the physician he'd found, the casino debt I'd noticed but not pressed him about. When I finished, Helen was silent for 4 or 5 seconds. Your phone, she said. Has he ever helped you with it? Settings, apps, anything? I thought back. 6 months earlier, shortly after Robert's first serious decline, my son had spent an evening helping me move my online banking to a new device. Patient, thorough, entirely unhurried, I had been grateful. Yes, I said. Tonight, buy a new phone. Use cash. Don't activate it with anything linked to your existing accounts. Call me from that when you have it. I drove to a Walmart 30 minutes away in a part of town I rarely visited, bought a prepaid phone, and activated it in the parking lot. Then I checked into a Comfort Inn near the highway, paying cash from the emergency fund I kept in an envelope in my coat lining, a habit formed early in my career at the CRA, when the first senior investigator who mentored me said, "Always have resources that belong only to you." I had never stopped. That night in the hotel room, I opened my personal laptop purchased under my own name, never connected to anything in my son's house, and began doing what I did best. Helen had the physician's name within 2 hours. Dr. Gerald Mash, a geriatric psychiatrist with a private practice in Langford. She found a complaint filed against him 18 months earlier with the BC College of Physicians and Surgeons, a family alleging falsified capacity assessment in an estate dispute. The complaint had been reviewed and closed for insufficient evidence. No formal action taken, but the record existed in the public database, precisely where it would remain until someone needed to find it. He had done this before. My son had found him on purpose. I wrote the name in a new notebook, started a dated evidence log, and called Patricia the following morning. She was an elder and estate law lawyer in downtown Victoria, recommended to me by a colleague from my CRA years who still worked in the legal community. When I laid out what I had, she listened without interrupting. "You understand their method," she said when I finished. "I investigated 3 conservatorship fraud schemes during my time at the agency," I said. "I know exactly how it's built, and I know exactly how it falls apart." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need from me? And what do you already have?" I returned to my son's house after 2 nights away, having explained my absence as a visit to an old colleague who lived across the water. My son expressed concern that was indistinguishable from genuine. He asked how I was feeling. He said they'd been a little worried. I told him I was perfectly fine and that I just needed some time after everything with Robert. My daughter-in-law made dinner and set a place for me, and my granddaughter, who was 9 and entirely without knowledge of any of this, came to the table with her school reading book and asked if I'd listen to her practice her chapter. I sat beside her and listened and told her she read beautifully, and I meant it, and I did not let her see what was behind my face. That evening, I was offered chamomile tea. My son made it himself, something he had not done in 18 months, and I watched him turn his back to the counter while the kettle was still hot. I accepted the mug, raised it to my lips the way I had drunk tea every evening of my adult life, and I did not swallow. I am not a natural performer, but I had spent 33 years sitting across tables from people who needed to believe I was only taking notes. That evening, I maintained a conversation about weather and my granddaughter's reading progress and the roofer my son was thinking of calling, and I let the tea cool in my hands and periodically raised it to my lips, and when no one was looking, I transferred a portion into the travel mug I'd brought in my coat pocket. In my room, door locked, I tested it with the strips I'd purchased at a pharmacy well outside our usual neighborhood. They changed color within seconds. Benzodiazepines. I photographed the result, labeled the image with the date and time, and texted Helen on the prepaid phone. T positive, starting collection, please back everything up off-site. Her reply came within minutes. 2 drives in cloud. Send everything. What do you need next? I set up the hidden camera the following morning, the kind sold at hardware stores for monitoring deliveries, small enough to fit inside an alarm clock I'd brought from a storage locker I rented separately. I replaced the clock on the guest room dresser. The audio recorder went into the cardigan I wore every evening in the common areas of the house. Then I played my part. I let myself forget names slowly, recovering them a moment too late with the particular embarrassed pause that real confusion produces. I asked what day it was on a Tuesday morning, looking mildly troubled by my own uncertainty. I left the back burner on twice, in situations where my son happened to be nearby. I did not overperform. I had assessed cognitive decline in fraud investigations often enough to know that real impairment is inconsistent and uneven, not theatrical. I gave them exactly what they needed to believe their plan was succeeding, and no more. The beverages continued. Tea, coffee, once a glass of orange juice left on the counter for me with a small white fragment visible at the bottom when I tilted the glass under the light. I documented every instance. The camera in my room recorded my daughter-in-law entering on 2 nights when she believed I was sleeping, going through the drawer where I kept my personal correspondence. I did not change the drawer's contents. I let her look. My son arranged the appointment with Dr. Mash as a general wellness visit with a specialist. He drove me there himself, solicitous and calm, and sat in the waiting room while I went in. I answered the doctor's questions with careful, practiced inconsistency, correct on some, hesitant and wrong on others, never so far off as to seem obviously fabricated. When he asked me to count backward from 100 by 7s, I stopped at 86 and looked at my hands. When he asked the name of the provincial premier, I gave the right name with the wrong confidence, then second-guessed myself unconvincingly. I had administered enough cognitive assessments during my working years to know the precise pattern of authentic impairment, and I reproduced its texture without its substance. On the drive home, my son told me the doctor had called him, that he was a little concerned, that there was something called a representation agreement he thought might help protect me. "I just want to make sure you're safe, Mum," he said. "That's all this is." "You're so good to me," I said, and looked out the window. Helen had by then, working with a forensic document examiner she'd sourced through a former CRA colleague, identified something in the financial declaration my son was preparing to file with the representation agreement application. The figures in one column did not align with what would have been generated from my actual account statements. The document had been altered. It was subtle, the kind of alteration that a general court reviewer would not notice, but that someone with 30 years of forensic financial examination would recognize in under 5 minutes. The bank review, which I had initiated quietly through a fraud officer at a branch I did not normally use, confirmed what I already suspected. A secondary device had been registered to my online banking profile 8 months earlier. Someone had been monitoring my account activity regularly. The bank froze the secondary access and produced an access log for Patricia's file. The log showed $17,000, moved in small increments to a joint account in my son's and daughter-in-law's names, beginning 2 weeks before Robert's death, When the inheritance was not yet legally confirmed but was presumably expected, he had not waited. He had begun preparing before he even knew for certain there was anything to take. Patricia reviewed everything and said, "Let them file the application. Let them believe they're in position. Then we present the full case at the hearing, all at once, and we give them no opportunity to adjust their account before it's on the record." The BC Supreme Court hearing date was set for the 3rd week of January. My son told me it was a procedural appointment related to Robert's estate. He asked me to dress appropriately. He seemed relaxed, confident in the way that people are confident when they believe they have already won. I wore the navy blazer I'd worn to every important professional meeting of my career. It still fit exactly as it always had. Patricia was seated near the back of the courtroom when we arrived. My son saw her and slowed his step. "Who is that?" "My lawyer," I said, and kept walking. The judge was thorough and unhurried. My son's lawyer presented the application methodically. Diminished capacity, family concern, protective measures in the client's best interest, the assessment from Dr. Mash. He was smooth in a way that suggested he had done this often and found it straightforward. My daughter-in-law testified about my forgetfulness, the incidents in the kitchen, the name I'd struggled to recall, the stove. Her voice carried exactly the right weight of sorrow. She was composed, she was persuasive. My son testified about his love for me. He used the phrase, "It breaks my heart," more than once. He spoke about Robert's death and its effect on me. He described an elderly woman declining in a way that was both affecting and entirely false. He was believable in the way people are believable when they have told a story enough times that it has stopped feeling like a lie. When Patricia stood, she did not begin with argument. She asked the court to hear evidence. The audio recording played first. My son's voice filled the room clearly, unhurried, walking through representation agreements and manufactured incapacity and the specific physician he'd selected and why. My daughter-in-law asking about the timeline, about the investment accounts, about when they could begin to liquidate. Every detail of the plan, spoken in their own kitchen, in their own words. The courtroom became very still. My son had gone motionless in the way that I had seen, across a desk, in an interview room, many times. The motionlessness of someone who has just understood that the position they believed themselves to be in no longer exists. Then, Patricia presented the documentation in sequence. The drug testing results, certified by a toxicologist engaged through a Victoria clinic. The camera footage from my room, time-stamped across multiple nights, showing my daughter-in-law going through my personal papers. The bank records showing $17,000 in irregular transfers, beginning before Robert's death. The complaint record against Dr. Mash, drawn from the college's public database, establishing a prior allegation of the same conduct. The forensic document examiner's affidavit regarding the altered financial declaration. Finally, she submitted my professional record. 33 years with the CRA. 47 fraud investigations resulting in successful prosecution, expert witness appearances in 9 court proceedings, a commendation from the Minister of National Revenue in 2011 for a complex cross-provincial asset concealment case. "Your Honor," Patricia said, "Mrs. Margaret Holloway is not mentally incapable. She is a former senior forensic investigator who identified a scheme being carried out against her by her own family, documented it over 3 weeks with professional rigor, and is present today in complete possession of her faculties." The judge looked at me. "Mrs. Holloway, do you wish to address the court?" I stood. My voice was clear and level. "Your Honor, I spent more than 3 decades of my career protecting people who could not protect themselves from those who wanted to take what wasn't theirs. I understand how these schemes are built because I spent most of my working life taking them apart. I did not expect to need that knowledge for this purpose, but I used it because it was what I had, and because my brother worked for 40 years to build what he left me, and I was not prepared to allow it to disappear into someone else's debt." I looked at my son. He was not looking back at me. "I am 68 years old," I said. "I am not confused, not about this." The application was dismissed. The matter was referred to the BC Prosecution Service. As the bailiff moved toward my son and my daughter-in-law, she reached for my arm. "Please," she said. Her voice had changed, the composure from the witness stand was gone. "We were desperate. The debt, you don't understand what it's been like. We didn't see any other way. You could have asked me, I said, quietly enough that only she could hear it. That is what I keep returning to. You could have simply asked me. She had no answer. They left the courtroom separately. Patricia walked me to the parking lot. The January air off the harbor was sharp and honest. You did everything right, she said. I did what was in front of me to do. I pulled my coat closed. It doesn't feel the way I expected. It rarely does, she said. Take care of yourself, Margaret. My granddaughter went to stay with her maternal grandparents during the weeks that followed. I made sure she was comfortable, that she had what she needed, that the people around her understood she was 9 years old and had done nothing wrong. I wrote her a letter and asked her grandparents to give it to her when she was older, 12, 13, whenever they felt it was right. I told her that none of what had happened between the adults in her family had anything to do with her, that she was loved, and that this kind of love does not depend on what people around you choose to do. The criminal proceedings moved through the court over the following months. My son was charged with fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and administering a noxious substance the toxicology had confirmed lorazepam at a dose calibrated for a woman of my age and weight. My daughter-in-law faced related charges as a party to the scheme. Dr. Mash was subject to a formal college complaint and a separate criminal charge for filing a false assessment in legal proceedings. I testified for the better part of a day. I was precise, methodical, thorough, without embellishment, because that was how I had always given evidence, and because I had learned long ago that facts assembled carefully speak for themselves. My son received 26 months. My daughter-in-law received 16. Dr. Mash lost his license and received a conditional sentence with strict terms. I did not attend the sentencing. Patricia called me that afternoon. I was sitting at the kitchen table of Robert's house in Oak Bay, drinking actual tea from Robert's old brown kettle that I'd found in the cupboard above the stove, which I had not changed because I was not ready to change it. It's done, she said. Thank you, I said, for everything. After she hung up, I sat for a while with the mug in both hands, looking out through the study window at the Gary oaks in the garden. Robert had planted 2 of them the summer he bought the house, the year I turned 35. They were enormous now, the way oaks become when you leave them alone long enough to be themselves. He had always been better at patience than I was. I moved into the house the week after the hearing. I walked through each room slowly and learned the particular quality of light in the study on winter mornings, the sound the fir floors made in the cold, the way the garden smelled after the kind of rain that goes on all day. It was the most beautiful place I had ever lived, and I was aware at almost every moment that it had very nearly not been mine. I began writing. Not the procedural frameworks and investigative guides of my working life, but something intended for a different reader. A plain language handbook on financial elder abuse, the early signs, how to document suspicious activity, what legal protections existed under BC law, where to find help. I contacted a colleague from my CRA years who now worked with the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee. She helped me map the gaps in what currently existed for seniors without professional backgrounds or strong support networks. The handbook became a 2-hour workshop. The workshop became a regular offering through 2 community legal clinics in the Capital Regional District. Within 8 months, I was receiving inquiries from seniors organizations in Nanaimo, Kelowna, and Kamloops asking whether the program could travel. I said yes to the ones I could manage and began looking for others who could cover the rest. Helen drove over from Nanaimo twice a month, and we worked at Robert's kitchen table, refining materials, reviewing cases that came in through the legal clinic referrals, occasionally just talking through what had happened the way people do when they're trying to put a thing in its right place. "Do you think about him?" she asked me one evening, not long after the sentencing. She meant my son. "Every day," I said. Less with anger now, more with a kind of incomprehension. I still can't entirely understand the distance between the person I thought I was raising and the choice he made. He had a lot of debt. "A lot of people have debt," I said. "They don't all make the same choice." 18 months after the sentencing, a letter arrived. My son's handwriting on the envelope, a return address from the correctional facility in Abbotsford. I set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for some time before I opened it. 3 pages, handwritten. He had been in a financial responsibility program inside. He had spent time going through what he'd done, trying to look at it without excusing it. He said he didn't expect forgiveness and was not writing to ask for it. He said there was $17,000 he owed me, and the interest on it, and whatever it took, he would repay it when he was working again. He understood if I never replied. At the end of the last page he had written, "I knew who you were. I knew exactly what you were capable of and what you had spent your life doing, and I told myself you were someone to be managed. I don't know how to explain that to you. I'm not sure I can explain it to myself. I'm sorry, Mum." I sat with that letter for the better part of an evening. Then I wrote back. Not to forgive, I was not in a position to offer that, and I would not pretend otherwise. But because I had spent my career on the belief that people cannot move forward without first looking clearly at what they have done, and whatever else my son was, he was still someone I had brought into the world, and I did not believe in leaving people with nothing to work toward. I wrote that I had received his letter. I wrote that the repayment, if he chose to make it, should go to the legal clinic rather than to me. I wrote that I hoped he built a life in which he made different choices. I wrote that I would not be waiting, but that the door was not permanently closed, and what happened next was his to determine. I folded the letter, addressed it, and drove to the post office on Oak Bay Avenue and mailed it myself. The following spring, my granddaughter's maternal grandparents called to ask if they might bring her to visit. She was 10 by then, nearly 11, old enough to ask questions and young enough not to have the edges of her curiosity worn down yet. She sat at Robert's kitchen table and showed me a school project on local ecosystems, and then she went to the window and saw the Gary oaks in the garden and asked about them, and I told her Robert had planted the 2 largest ones the year he moved in, and she became quietly, sincerely interested in this, the way children are when something connects them to the past. We sat together for 2 hours. She asked questions about the trees, about Robert, about what he had been like when he was young. I answered everything honestly and without holding back the parts that were sad. I showed her the coin collection, which I was slowly learning to understand on its own terms, the way Robert had understood it. I made hot chocolate from scratch, the way my own mother used to, with milk heated on the stove and proper cocoa powder and a small square of dark chocolate melted in, and we drank it together looking out at the garden in the April rain. When her grandparents came to collect her, she hugged me at the door with both arms and asked if she could come back. I said yes, whenever she wanted. After they left, I stood in the hallway and listened to the house settle quietly around me in the way old houses do in the evening. Robert had written, "Do something wonderful with it." I was learning what that meant, piece by piece. The workshops, the handbook now in its 2nd edition, the walks along the waterfront in the early morning that I had never allowed myself when I was working. The Thursday book club where no one knew my professional history and I was simply a woman who read too fast and had opinions about endings. The long calls with Helen. The slow pleasure of learning to inhabit a life that was, without qualification or condition, entirely mine. I was 69 years old. I had lost the version of my family I had believed in, and I had found, in its place, something harder and clearer and more honest. Some evenings, sitting on the back porch with tea that no one had touched except me, watching the Gary oaks move against the sky that goes luminous and green over the strait in the last light, I felt something close to peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the steadier peace of understanding precisely where you stand. Robert used to say that oaks take 100 years to become what they are, that you don't plant them for yourself, you plant them for whoever comes after you. I raised my mug toward the garden and toward him and went inside to work,